I put together a quick PowerPoint to better explain the different types of reality as they pertain to the psychology of awakening. Give me your feedback. Let me know if this is helpful for you or if it's not helpful. So, quick reality check on reality. I want to make it very clear that what I'm proposing here is what you find after you analyze the evidence, both pragmatically, empirically. Everything I talk about here is within what you find for science, spirituality, experientially. All of that comes together. I'm not proposing anything outlandish here. I'm not trying to claim that reality is fake, that reality is just an illusion. I'm trying to stick with the evidence here as much as possible. Some of the things that we talk about very soon are going to seem quite strange, especially for those who have not had a background in mental health, clinical psychology, those who really haven't seen the full spectrum of what the mind and psychological functioning can look like. A lot of these claims can sound a little strange, so I'm going to try to walk through in a little more detail so that things make more sense. In terms of reality as it's relevant to the psychology of awakening, there are three types of reality here. And before I discuss these, I want to make it very clear that there is only one type of reality at its fundamental core. We would call this ultimate reality. Ultimate in the sense that it's final, that it's last, that we can't go any further than this reality in terms of what we can realize for ourselves. However, for discussion, it's easier to break down this reality into ultimate reality and its manifestations, which include conventional reality and objective reality. Conventional reality is the reality we think about when we talk about psychological functions. And by psychological functions, I mean workings of the mind: attention, concentration, sensation, perception, all the different neuropsychological functions that we can think of. In a nutshell, conventional reality is the type of reality, again, as it's been constructed by the mind. So it takes objective reality and it breaks it down in terms of taking a small sliver of objective reality and then using that to create the reality that we see around us. In this sense, conventional reality is impermanent, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Objective reality is more so what we talk about in physics and math. This type of reality is independent of our own psychological functions, and I'll go over some examples of that in just a second here. All right, so again, conventional reality as it's been constructed by the mind. Every part of conventional reality can be changed, disrupted, or lost. When I'm talking about disruption or losing functions, I'm quite literally talking about the types of damage to the brain that can occur, or the types of changes in neuropsychological functions that someone can experience. So to give a better example of conventional reality, there are some pictures here, and I'm pretty sure everybody is going to say that there are different images of an apple here, okay? The different physical features that are present for this stimulus in terms of how we bind them: physical structure, colors, patterns, orientation. Our brain takes that information in and produces an apple, right? That's what we see in front of us. So we'll stick with apple here. On the top left, we have an apple in what people typically see for color vision. Okay, the apple's red, there's a green leaf, brown stem. However, you might have people who were born without color vision. You might also have people who lost their color vision from a traumatic brain injury, like cerebral achromatopsia, for example. A specific type of stroke or traumatic brain injury can do that. They will see the same stimulus that the person on the top left sees. However, they will register that stimulus in grayscale because they don't have the capability to produce color vision within the conventional reality that they perceive from the objective stimulus that they are perceiving for themselves. Now, on the bottom left, we take that same apple and we run it through an X-ray. So now we're messing with the electromagnetic spectrum and what's available for us within visible light. This is also an apple. However, it looks very, very different here because now we're viewing things through an X-ray. We have used a machine, a tool, to help bend the way we perceive this same underlying stimulus. But again, it's the same stimulus, right? The three left images and the bottom right as well. Bottom right image, now we're looking at the apple through infrared. Here in infrared, you can see that certain characteristics of the apple are lost. Some of the not the texture features, but the coloring patterns, it kind of looks uniform at this point. And again, there's advantages and disadvantages to having different ways of viewing reality, different ways of perceiving stimuli. So conventional reality is subjective, it's based on evolutionary needs, and it's different from person to person as well. However, there are general characteristics within the normally developed population. That's why most people see the top left image, even though there might be individual variances. However, there can be more dramatic variances as we go further down the right. Alright, so taking things a little bit broader, when we talk about objective reality, we're talking about reality as it exists independent of our own psychological functions. When we talk about apple, all four of those pictures on the previous slide, those are all classifiable as apple. However, the underlying physical stimulus that's there, the material object, which we don't necessarily have to give a name to, that's just what our brain chooses to register that stimulus as for apple, that's getting more towards the objective reality, right? If we took that apple and we went through the entire electromagnetic spectrum, there would be many ways to look at that object that we may or may not register as apple. However, they are also all a different perspective of the same underlying stimulus. So hopefully that makes sense. I know I've explained it a few times here, but it's very important because objective reality is what we think of when we're talking about physics and math. Oftentimes we see in physics that scientists will follow the math. They will go with what the equations tell them, even though their psychological functions, how they sense and perceive things, it's totally counterintuitive. However, we still get certain results because we're looking at reality in ways that are not so straightforward for our sensation and perception. We're using more reasoning abilities at that point. Now, it's important to mention objective reality because we need to learn to see for the psychology of awakening that reality is much deeper than how it appears to us at face value. Many people never learn to see reality past how it appears to their own psychological functions. This is why many types of changes in psychological functions can be very, very dramatic and difficult for people. We see this often in clinical disorders, right? Somebody goes through a very traumatic experience, maybe they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. All of a sudden, the way they sense and perceive things, their way of viewing conventional reality and engaging with it, it's changed dramatically. Before they might see a clock, everything's okay. Now they look at a clock because that's what they were seeing as something related to perhaps sexual assault happened. That was a case of mine in the past. And they had a very difficult time looking at clocks. So that association can change at any given time. Again, this is really important because we see that the way we perceive reality is not only constructed, but it changes over time. And because it changes, we can change our relationship to how we understand our view of reality, not only in the conventional sense, but also in the objective sense. And I left a little phrase here at the bottom. Oftentimes we hear people kind of repeat or parrot that God is a mathematician. That again is getting at the bias of our conventional reality, right? We're so used to seeing and parsing reality into symbols, whether it's mathematical equations, whether it's our use of language, that we might even make a biased claim like this, that, oh, because math works the way it does, because we perceive math to be so successful in quantifying and characterizing the universe, surely that must be the exact way the universe was constructed. However, this is not necessarily the case. It's just that math as we use it is the best we have for symbolizing the universe. We can find many flaws in math. We can find many difficulties, limitations, assumptions that we have to make down to the axioms that make mathematics work. Once we get to better understanding those things, again, we can see that even something as useful as mathematics, it comes with certain assumptions. And if we tie our understanding of reality to these types of assumptions, we are again forwarding our view of conventional reality onto reality as it actually is, independent of our own psychological functions. That type of mismatch is the very difficulty that can cause psychological suffering and challenges, as we'll talk about later on. So, a little phrase here to help explain the point. We have a stimulus between these two people, and based on the perspective of where they are, what they take in as conventional reality, and in terms of how their brain is perceiving the same stimulus, it's different. One person says 6, one person says 9. Different ways of viewing the same underlying objective reality. Okay? Now, one more important thing to say about objective reality is that it too is impermanent. Objective reality comes, objective reality goes. It's a manifestation. We can trace our knowable universe all the way back to the Big Bang. We don't know how to go beyond that point. However, we can see that everything that we have in terms of objective reality falls back to a singular, infinitely small point. Another example here, an ambiguous stimulus. This is a very famous one within sensation and perception. Is this a rabbit? Is it a duck? Depends on how you look at it, right? Perhaps it's not even either of them. It's just a stimulus that is designed to play with our sensation and perception capabilities. Again, something that helps point to the biases and limitations of how we perceive reality through our brain and through our psychological functions. Okay, so the third type of reality, and again, these types are artificial categories. There is just reality. However, to help with discussion, we're breaking it down into these 3 categories. This is the type of reality that we know of in its truest form. We call this, again, ultimate reality because this is the final type of reality. We will find that when we apply actual practices regarding awakening, that this is the furthest we can go. There is no further point in terms of how we can understand reality. Quite literally, ultimate reality goes beyond what our psychological functions can characterize. However, we can still realize ultimate reality because its manifestations are not separate from ultimate reality. What I mean by that is, even though conventional reality and objective reality are impermanent, meaning they're constantly in a state of change, and they manifested from this ultimate reality. Now, when I say ultimate reality, just to give a little bit more information here, you often hear phrases such as formless, without qualities, unconditioned. Again, these are all verbal descriptions. It's very, very difficult to understand that our language capabilities cannot reduce everything into symbols that we can readily take in. Once you let go of that bias, which is very, very difficult, especially when we've been raised up our entire lives and we know to think through language, it's very, very difficult to do this. But once you can realize this, it's very, very important for helping us deal with psychological suffering, because as we'll talk about in later videos, language is very well known to be one of the key factors that causes psychological suffering, especially when we take the reduced, symbolized, created type of reality that comes through language and we equate that to reality as it actually is. That's when we develop a lot of mental disorders, a lot of mental health challenges. That'll be for another video. It's going to be a very long topic, but lots of rich information there. So going down this slide a little bit more, there are different spiritual descriptions, because this ultimate reality is, when you get to the core of different spiritual traditions, this is what they are actually pointing to and talking about. You will hear different types of descriptions going anywhere from emptiness referring to conventional and objective realities not having any permanent existence, so they are empty of a permanent existence, all the way to the opposite end, where you say fullness, right? Ultimate reality, since it is not separate from objective or conventional reality, it is full in that sense, Even though conventional and objective realities are impermanent, they are full of ultimate reality because they're ultimately not separate. Once this is understood, then you can see, even when you look at your everyday experience, where ultimate reality lies. That's one of the key factors, again, that helps with awakening. So, reiterating this point again, ultimate reality is the finalized goal in terms of what is meant by awakening. And since we can't properly describe this type of reality, we have to realize it. This is where the practice comes in. Again, easier said than done. We're so used to intellectualizing things. Turning to that practice, pragmatic approach, that's going to be much more important. So what's the relevance of all this? Well, to put it in the most straightforward manner, realizing ultimate reality is what I am proposing here as the finalized goal to help put an end to psychological suffering. This claim is supported very well through literal millennia of data from various different spiritual traditions. A lot of them found the same conclusions independently, whether it was Buddhist, Hindu. We'll see some similar conclusions with Meister Eckhart, Taoist philosophies. There's many, many different types, and they all come to this same conclusion, that realizing our true nature is ultimate reality, not as it appears to be in terms of conventional reality, which also includes the sense of self. That is the way to put an end to psychological suffering. Additionally, misunderstanding ourselves as conventional reality or objective reality, because they are manifestations, because they are impermanent, that is bound to lead to psychological suffering. When we attach to something that's always in a state of change, it's pretty easy to see how that's going to lead to psychological problems down the road. Alright, so the main takeaways here. The most important thing I want to get across is that reality as it appears through us, through conventional and objective reality, although this is what we readily see in our day-to-day experience, they are without a permanent essence, and once we can let go of attachment to these realities, we can start to work our way towards realizing the ultimate reality that has always been there. It's just covered up by layers and layers of conventional and objective reality. Again, I'm not claiming that conventional reality or objective reality is fake. I'm just trying to state that since they are without a permanent essence, we should look a little bit further, because when we cling to things that have no permanent essence, we're bound to end up dealing with psychological problems or psychological suffering, whether it's clinical or existential or some combination of the two. I'll have many more videos to come out to explain things further. I don't expect this video to be comprehensive by any means, just trying to get the basic point across that reality is much more than it appears to us at face value. When we can start to really address that question and take it serious, that's when we can really start to dig a little bit further, find our way towards putting an end to psychological suffering.